Imagine you are an elite interrogator sitting across from a high-value asset. For months, you have read their baseline. You know exactly which buttons to press to get a reaction. You pull the strings, they dance. You step back, they reach out. You control the temperature of the room. This is the exact unwritten contract between an avoidant attachment style and a highly empathetic partner. It is a high-stakes game of behavioral chess where one person's vulnerability is used to shield the other person's terror. But then, overnight, the asset goes completely dark. No anger, no tears, no text messages demanding answers, no micro-expressions of longing or frustration, just absolute, unyielding, metric zero silence. What happens to the person who thought they were holding all the cards? Most relationship advice tells you that avoidants love space. They tell you that when an avoidant pushes an empath away, they go celebrate their freedom. They sit in their fortress of solitude, proud of their self-reliance. That is a lie. It is a fundamental misreading of human behavioral mechanics. What actually happens inside the nervous system of an avoidant when an empath stops talking is a catastrophic structural failure. It is what behavioral psychologists call a system collapse. When an avoidant pushes, they are counting on the empath to pull back. They require the empath's anxiety to calibrate their own equilibrium. The empath's desperate pursuit is the exact fuel the avoidant uses to prove to themselves, I am safe, I am independent, and I am the one in control. It is an addiction disguised as autonomy. But when the empath enters true silence, not the manipulative, passive-aggressive silent treatment, but the cold, quiet clarity of emotional exhaustion, the baseline drops to absolute zero. The avoidant's entire psychological architecture relies on a feedback loop that has just been permanently severed. In the next few minutes, we are going to strip away the pop psychology labels and look at the raw operational mechanics of this dynamic. We are going to map out the exact sequence of events that occurs when an avoidant's favorite survival mechanism backfires so spectacularly that it triggers an internal blackout. You will see precisely how the hunter becomes the psychologically hunted, why silence is the ultimate behavioral equalizer, and the terrifying reality of what happens when a human being is forced to sit in a room with the one thing they spent their entire life running from: themselves. If you have ever wondered why someone who seems so cold and untouchable suddenly unravels the moment you stop trying, pay very close attention to what comes next. We are about to decode a behavioral phenomenon that looks, from the outside, like a sudden shift in power, but on the inside operates like a controlled demolition. If you watch this complete analysis until the very end, you will possess a master key to human behavior. You will understand exactly why the most emotionally detached people on the planet are entirely dependent on the very people they push away, and how silence can completely dismantle a lifetime of psychological armor. Right now, somewhere in the world, an avoidant is actively pushing an empath away. They are triggering an ancient, predictable script. They withdraw. They withhold affection. They use stonewalling as an operational shield. They believe they are winning. They believe they have successfully protected their boundaries, but they are operating on a deeply flawed psychological premise. They are building a house of cards on top of a fault line, completely unaware that the person holding that fault line still is about to walk out of the room. To understand why the collapse happens, we have to profile the avoidant's internal operating system. An avoidant individual does not possess true independence. They possess hyper-independence, which is nothing more than a highly organized trauma response. Their entire ego structure is built on a single core directive: do not depend on anyone, because anyone you depend on will eventually exploit or abandon you. To maintain this illusion of absolute self-reliance, they need a metric. They need a proxy to measure their own strength against. Enter the empath. The empath provides an abundance of emotional data. They pursue, they fix, they heal, they overcommunicate. For the avoidant, this is the ultimate behavioral buffer. As long as the empath is chasing them, two things are true in the avoidant's subconscious mind. First, they know exactly where the empath is, meaning they are safe from unexpected abandonment. Second, they can use the empath's emotional intensity to look down and say, "Look how emotional they are, and look how calm and regulated I am. I am the superior, safe one here." The empath's anxiety is the mirror the avoidant uses to see their own stability. But the avoidant always overplays their hand. Because their tolerance for true intimacy is incredibly low, they continuously apply pressure to keep the empath at a distance. They look for flaws. They provoke arguments. They use dismissive nonverbal cues, averting eye contact, closing off their body language, sighing when emotional topics are raised. Eventually, they hit a critical threshold. They push so hard for so long that something snaps inside the empath's nervous system. Now, look closely at the empath's behavioral shift. It isn't a flash of anger. Anger is still engagement. Anger is still data. The avoidant knows how to manage an empath's anger. No, the shift happens when the empath enters the silence of full realization. This is the moment the empath realizes that the currency they are spending, their energy, their love, their tears, is being dropped into a black hole. The empath stops talking. They stop explaining themselves. They stop asking for reassurance. Their baseline drops to a flat line. This is where the operation goes completely sideways for the avoidant. Initially, the avoidant experiences a brief window of relief. They think, finally, the pressure is off. They enjoy the quiet for a matter of days, maybe even weeks. But human psychology operates on loops. When you are used to a constant stream of behavioral feedback, a sudden absolute vacuum creates severe psychological disorientation. The avoidant looks into the mirror, expecting to see the empath's anxious face looking back at them, validating their independence. Instead, the mirror is completely blank. In profiling, we know that human beings cannot tolerate a total lack of feedback. That creates a tracking error in the brain. The avoidant begins to ask internal questions that their operating system cannot answer. Are they still there? Are they plotting a departure? Have I lost my leverage? Suddenly, the space they weaponize to keep themselves safe becomes a prison. The silence they demanded becomes a deafening roar of uncertainty. Now the collapse begins. Without the empath's emotional pursuit to distract them, the avoidance defense mechanisms begin to turn inward. Imagine a submarine designed to withstand external water pressure, but suddenly the external pressure drops to absolute zero, while the internal pressure remains volatile. The hull begins to crack. The avoidant is forced, for the first time in perhaps decades, to look directly at their own internal landscape. And what is in that landscape? A profound, terrifying void of unhealed shame, immense loneliness, and the realization that their hyper-independence has not made them safe. It has made them completely alone. This is not a gentle realization. It is a systemic psychological breakdown. The avoidance nervous system goes into hyper-arousal. They may experience sudden surges of panic, obsessive tracking of the empath's social media, or a desperate need to find a proxy stimulus, a new distraction, a vice, or a rebound to fill the sudden void. They push the empath into silence to gain control, but the silence stripped them of the very data they needed to maintain that control. They are completely disarmed. The takeaway from this behavioral breakdown is sharp and uncompromising. In the theater of human relationships, distance is an illusion, and control is a temporary state of leverage. When an avoidant pushes an empath into true silence, they are not winning a battle of wills. They are unplugging the life support system of their own ego. They learn through a brutal process of psychological decompensation that you cannot dominate a void. If you are the empath in this scenario, understand that your silence is not a weapon, it is your boundary, and it is the most potent behavioral truth your partner may ever face. And if you are the avoidant, realize that the silence you are running from isn't coming from the person across the room. It is the echo of your own unresolved trauma. And until you face it, every bridge you build will eventually become a fortress you die in. To truly understand the weaponization of space, we must strip away the romanticized notion that an avoidance withdrawal is merely a passive need to clear their head or regulate a sensitive nervous system. In the cold, calculating arena of behavioral mechanics, distance is not a defensive retreat. It is an offensive maneuver designed to alter the power dynamics of the relationship. When an avoidant feels the claustrophobia of true emotional intimacy, when the empath gets close enough to see past the carefully constructed facade of self-reliance, the avoidant's internal alarms trigger a red alert. The proximity of the empath threatens to expose the avoidant's core vulnerability, the terrifying reality that they are, in fact, human, flawed, and dependent on another person. To neutralize this threat, the avoidant deploys space as a tactical intervention. By physically or emotionally withdrawing, they instantly force a shift in the environmental baseline. They are no longer a participant in a shared emotional experience. They position themselves as the arbiter of connection, deciding exactly when, where, and how much interaction is permitted. This calculated withdrawal serves a dual purpose. First, it immediately lowers the avoidant's internal anxiety by removing the immediate stimulus of intimacy. Second, and far more insidiously, it shifts the psychological burden entirely onto the empath. The avoidant knows, based on historical behavioral data, that the empath cannot tolerate prolonged ambiguity or emotional disconnection. By creating a vacuum, the avoidant effectively dictates the terms of engagement. They draw a line in the sand and watch as the empath is forced to cross it, agonizing over what they did wrong, how to fix it, and how to bridge the newly manufactured chasm. This dynamic ensures that the avoidant remains firmly in the driver's seat of the relationship's emotional cadence. The weaponization of space is an exercise in asymmetrical warfare, where the avoidant uses silence, delayed text responses, physical absence, and stonewalling to systematically erode the empath's confidence. It is a psychological leverage play. Every inch of distance created by the avoidant acts as a stressor that activates the empath's anxious attachment system, guaranteeing that when connection is finally reestablished, it will be on the avoidant's terms, with the empath acting from a posture of gratitude and compliance rather than equality. The avoidant uses this manufactured distance to train the empath, teaching them that asserting needs or seeking deeper intimacy will be punished with exile. This establishes a behavioral pattern where the avoidant maintains psychological dominance not through active aggression, but through the systematic withholding of presence. The space becomes a wall behind which the avoidant can hide the profound fear of rejection, all while projecting an image of calm, unshakable superiority. They look at the scrambling, anxious empath from across the void they created and use that distress to validate their own toxic narrative, that they are the stable, rational anchor, and the empath is the volatile liability. By manipulating the literal and figurative distance between them, the avoidant ensures they never have to meet the empath on level ground. converting what should be a sanctuary of mutual vulnerability into a highly controlled, deeply stratified theater of psychological management. The shift from an impasse anxious pursuit to absolute unyielding silence is the exact moment the avoidant psychological architecture suffers a catastrophic tracking error. To map this mechanically, we must look at how the avoidance internal software processes behavioral data. For months, or perhaps even years, the avoidant has operated under a highly predictable predictive model. In this model, the avoidant withdraws and the empath pursues. The avoidant stonewalls and the empath attempts to decode the silence. The avoidant creates a vacuum and the empath expands their own emotional energy to fill it. This constant influx of anxious data, the long paragraphs via text, the tearful pleas for communication, the micro-expressions of desperation, serves as the baseline for the avoidant's entire reality. It is the metric by which they measure their safety, their control, and their value. But when the empath undergoes a profound internal shift and falls truly silent, the baseline does not just fluctuate, it completely vanishes. This silent baseline shift is not a tactical game of the silent treatment, which is noisy, loud, and heavy with passive-aggressive energy that the avoidant easily recognizes as a demand for attention. True empathic silence is the quiet, chilling sound of a closed door. It is the absolute cessation of emotional transmission. When this flat line occurs, the avoidance predictive model instantly fails because their system is suddenly deprived of the very data it requires to function. In behavioral profiling, we know that human beings cannot successfully navigate an environment that offers zero feedback. The avoidance mind begins to experience severe cognitive dissonance. The silence acts as an invisible wall, completely obscuring the empath's internal state. The avoidant can no longer read the room. They can no longer tell if the empath is angry, heartbroken, indifferent, or planning a permanent exit. This lack of visibility triggers an immediate internal crisis. The avoidant's psychological survival depends on being able to anticipate threats, and an unpredictable partner is the ultimate threat to their hyper-independent fortress. Without the empath's anxiety acting as a constant indicator of where the relationship stands, the avoidant is cast adrift in a vacuum of absolute uncertainty. The silence completely neutralizes their ability to manage the relationship dynamically. They cannot deploy their standard defense mechanisms because there is no incoming emotional force to defend against. You cannot push away someone who is already standing perfectly still. You cannot stonewall someone who has stopped speaking. The sudden drop to a zero-metric environment forces the avoidance nervous system out of its comfortable state of detached superiority and into a state of high-alert hypervigilance. They become obsessively focused on the lack of signal, tracking every minor movement, every shift in posture, and every empty hour that passes without a message. The silence becomes a mirror that reflects nothing but the avoidant's own profound isolation, forcing their brain to run simulation after simulation to try and figure out what the quiet means. By cutting off the emotional feedback loop, the empath effectively pulls the plug on the avoidant's operational power source, leaving their psychological defenses spinning violently in a void of their own making. The concept of the unconscious mirror is fundamental to decoding the avoidant's psychological architecture, yet it is widely misunderstood as a simple lack of empathy. In behavioral profiling, we define this mirror not as a romantic connection, but as a critical structural necessity for the avoidant's fragile ego. The avoidant individual operates under a severe, deeply ingrained belief that their own need for attachment is a dangerous liability. To survive, they do not integrate this need, they amputate it. They suppress their desire for connection so completely that it becomes an unconscious force. And this is where the empath enters the operational framework. The avoidant requires an external proxy to carry the weight of their own repressed vulnerability. They seek out the empath, whose natural inclination toward open, expressive emotional output provides the perfect vessel for this projection. When the empath pursues, cries, or demands closeness, the avoidant does not just see a partner, they see a mirror image of their own suppressed internal state. By actively rejecting the empath, the avoidant is performing an act of self-surgery, cutting away the parts of themselves that they deem weak or unworthy. This is why the dynamic is so compelling for the avoidant. It allows them to maintain a constant, verifiable sense of dominance and independence. As long as the empath is present, striving, and focused on the relationship, the avoidant can calibrate their own identity against that pursuit. They can look at the empath's behavior and categorize it as needy, thereby reaffirming their own identity as self-sufficient. The empath's obsession becomes the metric the avoidant uses to confirm their own psychological safety. It is a closed-loop system of validation. However, this entire structure relies on the empath remaining a compliant, reactive subject. The moment the empath enters true, chilling silence, the mirror is effectively shattered. The avoidant looks into the space where the empath used to be, expecting to see the reflection of their own superiority. But instead, they find only a void. The projection has nowhere to go. The empath is no longer absorbing the avoidant's emotional data, which means the avoidant is suddenly, violently forced to encounter the raw, repressed material they have spent a lifetime delegating. This is the onset of profound internal chaos. Without the empath to act as a container for their fears of abandonment and unworthiness, the avoidant is left to contend with these issues in isolation. They are no longer the one holding the cards in a game of emotional distance. They are now the only player at the table, forced to play against their own shadow. The lack of a mirror means they can no longer distinguish their internal reality from their external narrative. They are hit with a sudden, disorienting realization that the independence they prized was merely a reactive posture, not a genuine trait. They are confronted with the terrifying, silent echo of their own unhealed trauma, which they can no longer blame on the empath's intensity or demands. The system is no longer being fed, and in the absence of that external stimulus, the avoidance defensive layers begin to erode. They cannot self-regulate because they have never learned the mechanics of internal containment. They have only ever learned how to externalize their volatility onto others. They are exposed to the very emptiness they were running from, and they have no tools to bridge the gap between their public persona and their internal state. The mirror is gone, and the darkness they were projecting onto the empath is now turning inward, forcing them to confront the one person they have spent their entire existence avoiding. To analyze the mechanics of the avoidant collapse, we must look at it through the lens of clinical decompensation, a systemic structural failure of a person's psychological defense mechanisms. In behavioral analysis, an avoidance personality is not a fluid, adaptable entity. It is a rigid, highly engineered fortress designed to keep intimacy out and internal terror locked in. This fortress relies entirely on the stability of external variables to maintain its structural integrity. When the empath permanently drops into absolute silence, the primary load-bearing pillar of the avoidance defense system is instantaneously kicked out. What follows is not a gradual emotional decline, but a rapid, cascading failure of their entire operational architecture. In clinical terms, decompensation occurs when a subject's coping mechanisms are completely overwhelmed by environmental stress, rendering them incapable of maintaining their usual public facade or internal equilibrium. For the avoidant, the ultimate environmental stressor is not conflict or criticism. It is the absolute absence of a reactive signal. When the empath stops participating in the dynamic, the avoidant's primary defense mechanism, detachment, loses its functional utility. You cannot detach from someone who has already emotionally left the field of play. As the reality of this vacuum sinks in, the avoidant subconscious enters a state of severe crisis. The primitive layers of the brain, specifically the survival circuits, realize that the tracking data is gone, triggering a profound sense of psychological vertigo. The avoidant is suddenly flooded with the very emotions their defenses were built to suppress: intense abandonment anxiety, toxic shame, and absolute powerlessness. Because they have spent a lifetime bypassing the development of internal self-regulation tools, opting instead for environmental manipulation, they have no internal containment system to handle this emotional surge. The psychological armor begins to buckle under the weight of the repressed trauma that has suddenly been forced to the surface. Observers will see the outward manifestations of this internal collapse, which often look erratic, desperate, and entirely uncharacteristic of the avoidance baseline persona. They may experience severe sleep disturbances, sudden bursts of panic, or an obsessive need to monitor the empath's digital footprint, searching desperately for any scrap of data that proves they still have an impact. In many cases, the decompensation protocol forces them into frantic, highly impulsive behaviors designed to numb the sudden onslaught of internal pain. They might plunge into excessive work, engage in reckless thrill-seeking, or rapidly seek out rebound attachments in a desperate attempt to manufacture a new external mirror before the old one shatters completely. The collapse is a state of raw, unmitigated vulnerability, where the avoidant's carefully curated illusion of control is exposed as an absolute fiction. They are stripped of their emotional leverage and forced to experience the full, crushing weight of the isolation they spent their entire life creating. The internal chaos becomes so profound that the avoidant can no longer maintain their cognitive scripts of superiority or indifference. They are reduced to a state of psychological survival, trapped inside a broken system that is burning through its remaining energy reserves just to keep from completely dissolving into the void of their own unresolved past. The final stage of this behavioral breakdown centers on the complete and irreversible power reversal that occurs when an avoidant is stripped of their primary currency, data. In the domain of behavioral profiling and tactical interpersonal dynamics, control is never an inherent trait. It is a fluid state derived entirely from informational asymmetry. For the duration of the relationship, the avoidant maintained the upper hand because they possessed a monopoly on the emotional narrative. They were the ones who decided when a text was answered, when affection was granted, and when the wall of silence would be erected. They operated with the distinct advantage of a subject who could observe their partner's chaotic emotional output while remaining completely concealed behind a mask of detached indifference. This asymmetry allowed them to manipulate the environment at will, using the empath's predictable, highly visible reactions to adjust their own position and maintain a position of psychological dominance. However, when the empath transitions into the quiet clarity of true silence, the information asymmetry instantly flips. By withdrawing all emotional output, all verbal explanations, and all behavioral markers, the empath effectively cuts off the transmission of raw data into the environment. In behavioral analysis, you cannot profile, manage, or manipulate a subject who refuses to provide a baseline. The avoidant suddenly finds themselves completely blind. They can no longer look at the empath to read the internal